The aesthetics of maps in TF2 are very interesting to me. As we all know, TF2 takes place in the Badlands, a massive plot of desert in New Mexico with no value that two brothers fight over, and the early maps align with this setting quite well, or I guess the other way around since the story for TF2 came later. First we got Touhou, which makes sense, just two buildings in what seems to be a very long stretch of desert. Dust Bowl goes even harder on this, with more muted colors making the map slightly darker in places. Hydro is really interesting, since while it's still clearly a desert, it's had a lot more work done to it in-universe with concrete buildings at each point. On that note, you notice how the buildings on Dust Bowl get more complex as the map goes on, going from wooden shacks to concrete buildings with launch pads? I just noticed that as I was writing this. Gravel Pit is great just for the laser beam at the top, feels very 60s/70s sci-fi, so I like it even if it doesn't do anything, and once again, very clearly in the desert. And then there's Well with another launch pad, and this one takes place in the train yard, with way less desert than the previous maps. And then there's Granary, which is even more interesting since it gradually becomes more industrial as you go to the blue side, just like Touhou, but much more clearly isn't a desert, instead having more lush farmland and more industry than usual on the blue side. I mean, there's an ocean right there. You know, looking back on it, Touhou wasn't that much of a desert either. Worth noting, the maps in TFC were a lot more industrial overall, Touhou being a great example. Dust Bowl is the outlier here if you ask me, feeling like a clump of sand modeled into a map. The aesthetics of the maps in TFC aren't super relevant to the rest of the video, but I felt there was value in bringing them up. After the launch of the game, we got updates, with the first major update adding Gold Rush, which, while introducing a new game mode, still takes place in a desert environment. Then the Pyro update with another desert map, and a map that takes place entirely indoors. Heavy update comes out and we get Arena mode with Arena Lumberyard, which aesthetically takes the biggest departure from the launch maps. The grass is green, the mountains have snow caps, and the valleys are full of trees. If it sounds like I'm frustrated with the inconsistency of Valve's maps, I'm not. In fact, Valve made up for it with a brand new desert map in the Scout update. Egypt! Okay, they may have gone a bit too far here. Are we really expected to believe these matches still take place in a plot of desert in New Mexico? Come on! What's next, a snow map? They even make a point about how it's the first snow map in TF2. Like it's something for them to be proud of. I mean, it's kind of cool, but what about the lore that didn't exist yet? So why does this matter? For many years, people have complained about the art and art style of TF2 degrading over time, primarily pointing to the cosmetics, but I hadn't seen anyone apply the same logic to the maps. Did the maps degrade over time? Did the maps stray too far away from the original vision? With this thought process, I noticed even the launch maps have inconsistencies. Or should I say would have inconsistencies if there was a story, which there now is. By mid-2009, there had only been one comic for Team Fortress 2. Yeah, there were the Meet the Team videos, but those were super character-driven and didn't do nearly as much for world building as the comics would go on to do. TF2 didn't start with a lot of story. There wasn't room for one, but as the updates got more ambitious, they found the perfect way to explore the Mercs world. Comics. Over the years, the comics have spawned ancillary characters, then assistants to ancillary characters. Companies mentioned in passing became global empires 3 generations old. The game that started as a handful of guys in a desert shooting at each other slowly blossomed into the most labyrinthine story in Valve history. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's straight from the website. TF2 was not meant to be a deep game. It was mechanically deep, but that depth wasn't prioritized until years later. And the lore is a much more obvious example of how depth wasn't the biggest priority for Valve when making TF2. They were just making a fun game that built on what they had done previously. And then the game changed and evolved by virtue of having major updates add new content for a full decade. It's cool seeing a game's evolution. It's cool seeing where a game started and where it is now. We've seen TF2 take missteps with its additions and add mechanics now seen as some of the best in the game. And through all of it, it's persevered. Was there a peak for TF2 and has that peak passed? That's a pretty subjective statement, but if you think that TF2 has gotten past its prime, I don't blame you. But is TF2 still one of the best multiplayer video games ever made? I'd confidently say yes.